The others will start joining us as the time comes. And I would like our current speakers to introduce themselves. Please, Kathy Lee, could you go on?
Yeah, sure. And hi, everyone. I'm Kathy. And I think this title of the event is really interesting on adaptation finance, especially in Africa. And just relevant background of myself, I'm a youth advisor to the CEO of Global Center on Adaptation, focusing on adaptation and also especially with a focus on Africa. And by profession, I work in sustainable finance and have been following the finance negotiations and processes under the convention since I was about 20 years old. So yeah, I think this is such an interesting topic and looking forward to sharing my views.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And we would like to invite to Jonas Schaefer to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jonas. I'm from Germany, and I'm part of a climate education organization. It's called Climate Science. And so I like to bring a little bit of a different perspective because I don't have the traditional climate finance background that the other two here definitely have. So I like to focus a little bit more in my parts about community, about youth engagement, and kind of putting some of these aspects into our conversation. So I think it will be interesting.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. And well, as in, we know the situation that right now Africa is facing, especially with climate change and climate finance. So even though these climate funds exist, it is very surprising that we have not reached the finance goal yet for these countries, taking in mind that they are already being the most affected countries by climate change, by the impacts of climate change. So then we would like to wonder about this, make an interactive discussion, and if anyone in the public would like to intervene in the conversation, you're welcome to. So the first question for our panelists, and also for the panelists on the internet. Hi. Oh, sorry. I forgot. Could you please introduce yourself? I'm sorry. Go on, please.
Oh, good. No worries. It's the new way of the world, isn't it? Doing everything the hybrid. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Anay Kitsi, and I'm the CEO and founder of Young Women in Sustainable Development. So we're an organisation currently working in 47 countries around the world to empower and build the capacity of young women to be leaders in their own communities. The vast majority of our team is situated in Africa, particularly Central and Southern Africa. So this is a really, really important topic for us, especially what we've been hearing from our volunteers about the issues they've had with accessing finance that are related to climate adaptation. So very excited to be here and to share in this important discussion with you all.
Thank you so much. And well, I'll introduce myself as well. My name is Melissa Jimenez Gomez Tagle. I'm from Mexico, but I work with the issue of climate financing, and I'm a master's student of sustainable resource management. And we know that the management of economical resources is also important to know how to face these crises that it's hitting us, but it's hitting us unequally. So we need to know where to focus those resources properly to be able to, all of us, all humanity, to have a livable future. So the first question for all our panelists would be, why do you think the African continent is struggling to have access to climate finance to support the adaptative capacities of its population? And I would like to give the floor to Kathy, please.
Sure, let me try to unmute myself. This is not doing wait.
Let me.
Okay, it's working. Thank you. Yeah, so why is it challenging? I think obviously, the irrelevance to the economy, and also And putting in the context of the UNFCCC, it's also relevant to what support they receive, what resources they have. And of course, thinking about capacity building, about finance, whether developed countries have met their $100 billion promise, and the answer is no, and whether there's enough support in terms of capacity building. Of course, I think parties are really trying their best and working on it, but of course, it is still not sufficient, and especially this event is about adaptation, that the ideal is to have a 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation. And of course, very happy to see that parties promised to double adaptation finance, and now we're landing at a bit over 40% after the Glasgow promise. But that is still not 50%, and which also shows how hard it is to set the goals and also to actually meet them. And yes, so capacity building, finance, and also there are so many other areas, for example, technology. But personally, I really love what UNFCCC is doing on technology development and transfer in terms of support to developing countries. In Africa, for example, the amazing work the CTCN is doing on technology needs assessment, and also providing support to developing countries to support them in technology development and transfer. And I think colleagues are really working very hard to support on this. And I'm really happy to see that in a technology in which people usually might assume that it's more mitigation focused, that now there's so much and also growing attention on adaptation.
Thank you so much. And could you please go on? Thank you.
Okay, I totally agree. I think there's a lot of good points that you mentioned. I also just recently looked up again the number to make sure. I believe currently there's through 2030 around 265 billion US dollars that are missing for climate finance in Africa. And the problem is that this is actually already excluding the amount that the actual African countries are contributing to this climate finance to actually be able to finance their own adaptation measures. And I think we have to keep in mind that there have been these promises that we've seen from the different agreements that we've had, of course, on the UN level. But nevertheless, we have to make sure that the governance is actually following through on these commitments, and we've seen that that hasn't been the case yet. And we believe that there's a lot more potential to actually follow through and actually act on these commitments that have been made.
Thank you so much, Jonas. We would like to invite Elizabeth Golugulu to come in to the floor.
Come join us.
Because we would be very interested on your input regarding this as well. So, could you? The question. Would you like first to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the platform and for the invitation. My name is Elizabeth Golugulu. I'm from Zimbabwe. I work for a youth organization called African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, and I'm also the Global South Focal Point for the Children and Youth constituency of the UNFCCC.
Thank you so much. And what do you think regarding this African issue, struggling with climate finance? Why do you think this is going on?
Yes, it has to go on because, Africa heavily depends on agriculture as a source of livelihood. And according to the IPCC recently launched report, it highlighted that the impacts of climate change will continue if Africa does not act. And this will affect the agriculture sector, and this will also affect the livelihoods of people. Also putting into consideration that Africa has the highest population of young people, and I think approximately 60% of young people, of the population of Africa are young people. And these young people, they do not have jobs. And some of them, they depend on agriculture. So when we're talking about finances, we're saying that if people lose their jobs, if people lose their livelihoods, then the issue of finance comes into play, because at the end of the day, people need to live, people need to survive. People are working for their stomachs at the end of the day. So issues to do with climate finance, it is very important, because at the same time, we also have young people that are coming up with certain initiatives to tackle the effects of climate change. Could it be adaptation or mitigation? But for them to implement or for them to upscale this initiative, there is need for resources, there is need for finances. So issues to do with finances will always be a problem and will always be talked about in the African continent.
Thank you so much. And we would like to ask our panelists online, what do you think about this finance problem in Africa?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and welcome, Liz, and thank you for your insights. But yeah, absolutely, to echo what Liz was saying, I think the agriculture is something that we're really seeing on the ground from our teams. There's a particular project that came to mind when Liz was talking, which is about transitioning agricultural practices around adapting to climate change and trying to address the climate crisis while still maintaining livelihoods, which is one of the amazing programs that one of the young women involved with our organisation is running. But again, as you said, there's that constant need for finance, and we're seeing from a lot of young women who are part of our network that how financial structures have been created with grants and funding. The smaller grassroots organisations often don't have the capacity to be able to fill out those really lengthy grant processes or to be able to meet the sort of technical requirements that are often required for these larger scale grants. But we're not seeing a backup of those smaller scale sort of one-off grants that are sort of less money, but just also so important in being able to get these projects off the ground and actually getting it through that pilot phase to show what's working, to be able to get these bigger grants. So I think as Liz was saying, I think the climate finance really holds the key to be able to unlock a lot of these grassroots solutions and really scale them up, because we're seeing, from within the region doing so many amazing things and really at the forefront of climate action and sustainable solutions. So it'll be definitely something for us to think about as a global community of how do we increase access to these funds and to this capital, because it's so important if we're going to drive the action that we need.
You're right. Thank you so much. Thank you for this insightful participation. So now with this context, what do you think are the core challenges that African countries face when trying to access to climate finance for adaptation, and why do these challenges exist? Kathy, please.
Yeah, sure. I think challenges are quite similar to what we mentioned: technology, finance, capacity building, promises from developed countries not being met. In terms of how to bridge these gaps, I think of course that one of the most direct answer would be for Annex 1 parties to meet their promises, and also, for example, to provide more support and explore more ways to ensure that they're not only just providing the technology or providing the direct support that cannot actually empower the people living in Africa, and also for example in education system, and also to ensure that there are skill sets being built, and also there's knowledge sharing, capacity building that would really help them to be sustainably can really carry on with working on this topic, and also support, for example, R&D initiatives in Africa, providing more support to to the African-led initiatives, and also for example, AFDB, talking about very boring public finance and MDB system, then AFDB is great that it has AAA system, but many MDBs in Africa struggle with de-risking, and also struggle with to make sure that they attract private capital, and to ensure that they support local markets, while also ensuring that they have really amazing international credit rating. It sometimes can be very challenging.
Thank you. Liz, what would be your input?
Thank you. Yes, the challenges that are there when it comes to accessing climate finance, I mean, the requirements and the criteria itself is just problematic. Sometimes the requirements that are asked, especially when it comes to youth organizations, we cannot meet them. When you want to access climate finance, there are so many barriers. Sometimes you're requested to produce an audited bank statement. Sometimes there is this opportunity that we got, and it needed a youth organization to have at least 30,000 US dollars in their bank account, which will be reimbursed after they implement the project. I mean, this is not so youth-friendly, because in Africa, tell me a youth organization that has 30,000 in their bank account. They could be there, but not so many. So you see that even the requirements for us to access those funds is just not so flexible for young people to have access to the funds. Then besides the requirements, in most cases, there are issues to do with capacity, institutional capacity for youth organizations. This is also lacking when it comes to African organizations. They lack the institutional capacity. Most of African young people, they operate their work from home on a voluntary basis. So this is really a challenge, because definitely we would want to give resources to someone who is working from home. They will need to see the authenticity of your organization. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing, speaking from an African perspective.
Thank you, Liz. And Jonas, what would be your input?
Right, so actually I had a very interesting session I think it was yesterday, about a new type of organization that was basically trying to gap some of the things that were just being addressed, being that it is often very challenging, especially for youth-led organizations, especially from developing countries, to be able to get finance for their climate change, adaptation, and also mitigation projects. And so one of the proposals there that were made was that the big organizations, like for example the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, which has a lot of funding and has a lot of capabilities, just doesn't quite provide the type of accessible grants that are going to actually impact these local smaller projects. And thus there's some organizations that are looking into how to facilitate a process where there's multiple steps in financing, where you can start with a smaller version of the project that you initially intended to do, but therefore you can make the grants much more accessible to a wider audience, and then more have an iterative process instead of having these major grant proposals going for many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of US dollars sometimes, to put these actions into practice. So I think there's some ideas on how to approach these challenges, but there's a lot of systems, I believe, that aren't quite in place to accommodate these type of situations from organizations from all over the world, but especially, of course, in Africa.
Thank you so much. And I do agree that sometimes the system is the one driving us into this whole issue. We would like to know the input from Anne.
Yeah, I think all of the panelists raised really excellent points, and I agree completely with what's been said. I think one thing that I probably would like to add to what's been said is just the way that structures are put in place around financing that really haven't been created with youth at the centre, and haven't been consulted with youth in the process of creating it. Lots of the things, I think it was Liz that mentioned it, about, often as youth, we're working from our lounge rooms, we're working from home, running programs, we work full time, or we study, or we go to school, or, any of those things. And so then being able to commit, 80 hours to writing an in-depth grant application, it's just not going to be possible if you want to keep your project running. So I think really having greater youth involvement in the setup of these climate finance structures, I think would go a long way to breaking down those kinds of barriers. And definitely something that I'm hoping forums like this will highlight the importance of that.
Thank you. And the next question for our panelists would be, are there best practices and success stories about some African countries that have successfully accessed adaptation finance? What are their strengths, and how did they overcome the existing challenges in accessing climate finance for adaptation? Kathy?
Sure, thanks. And really sorry that I have to leave early, which is why I'm speaking first. I think there are definitely success stories in terms of national governments, receiving, multilateral funding supports. But of course, looking, for example, at the $100 billion, most of it comes from in the form of loans instead of grants, which, for adaptation is really important for it to make sure that, it's grants-based instead of loans, because, think about the most vulnerable countries, the LDCs, it's just not practical and not, inclusive for them to absorb all the loans and also to make sure that they pay it back, one day in the near future. And in terms of success stories, looking at multilateral funds, GCF and GEF, they and Adaptation Fund, and many more, for example, like World Bank, like CIF, like IFC, many of them provide so much support to African nations or African initiatives from Africa. And just an example that I've been engaged in from the Global Center on Adaptation, we have a really, really amazing initiative called Youth Adapt, which basically is supporting 10 youth initiatives, 10 youth winners of this initiative from Africa with, I believe, is $10,000 each. And this is in collaboration with Africa Development Bank, AFDB, and CIF, the Climate Investment Fund. And I think, there's so much attention from my organization, Global Center on Adaptation. The whole organization is really keen on this, and also from AFDB, the president himself is also keen on this, and same likewise for CIF. And I think, with all these support from, either MDBs or organizations or IGOs, I think all these support are going to Africa, but of course, this is just one little example. If you look at, all the support finance globally, then of course, I definitely agree that, adaptation finance for Africa definitely needs to be given more support and more attention. And also thinking about other success stories, for example, if we are not focusing on national governments, thinking about civil society stakeholders, then I totally agree with Liz. It's really challenging for them to access grants. For example, I've heard many stories of how long it can take, how many forms they have to fill to get, for example, grants from EU or funds like GCF and GEF. Although I've also heard many stories how amazing the AFCIA project is from AF. It's still very challenging for youth-led or women-led or projects from indigenous communities or local communities to actually access grants. And also the application process itself is very inclusive. It requires digital access. It requires you to fill in so many forms to collect all the data, to for example, have a bank statement or have audit process. I think these are really making the process not inclusive. And I think there needs to be a way to ensure that, whilst we ensure that there's no, for example, fraudulent behaviors, but also to ensure that, the people who really need the support, who might not be very tech savvy or have, been given many privilege for education, can actually have the opportunity to receive grants and also to receive financial or capacity building support if they have amazing ideas or projects. Thanks. And really apologize again that I have to leave.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being with us. And what do you think, Liz, about this?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Kathy said on the need for African young people to get access to these resources, though it has been very, very challenging and difficult, speaking from experience as myself and other young people from the continent. I know we have different governments that have really tried by all means to engage young people and make sure that they are well-resourced, well-capacitated. For example, South Africa, they have these grants that they normally give to environmental organizations each and every year to implement, because they've also understood that young people are important stakeholders. So the moment our African governments realize that young people are important stakeholders, I think this might actually change the way they think and the way they might actually get to support young people. But if they just see young people as, being put in the brackets of vulnerable groups, it is very difficult for them to understand or for them to prioritize them in terms of resource allocation. What we have started to do is to, advocating for a flexible fund, a youth fund, making sure that at least the requirements are not that complicated and they are quite easy, considering that it's very difficult for us to even apply through the GCF or the GEF. So this is some of the initiatives that young people are now doing for themselves, led by youth for the youth, because we have seen that it's so difficult reaching out to big institutions or even to our governments to support us to implement, yet we are the ones that are doing the work and the real action on the ground.
Thank you. And what do you think, Jonas? What can you bring?
Okay, I would like to add one point actually about success stories, because we just talked about success stories. Are there any that we can share? And of course, there were some really nice stories that you mentioned. I also believe that actually the fact that success stories aren't very publicized is another big issue, because I think that for a lot of us, we're not as aware of the success stories that are actually working. And I think this definitely connects to the capacity building aspect. I think there's a lack of communication and reach for some of these projects that are working to be able to also share this knowledge with others and implement projects that don't only work in one place, but you could actually roll out across the African continent or in different nations. And I know that there's, we talked about kind of structures that sometimes are in the way. I believe that this is quite a useful reference in that sense, that I believe we have to have more structural support also for these countries to be able to exchange what is working, what doesn't work, and then the same process will help also the organizations themselves to understand what can they do that will be more likely to be fundable by these different funding bodies. And I think that obviously when we're looking at COP27, I think that that is one place where we definitely want to have this opportunity to network across African countries, and where we want to try to make the best out of this so that the different countries can learn how to actually go about these adaptation measures on the national level, of course, but also then for the different institutions and stakeholders that are going to take action on the ground on the local level.
Thank you so much. Dear Anne, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think echoing what Jonas said, I really think that these big changes that happen in countries and regions really do start at the grassroots level. I think there's so much amazing work that governments and other important structures can provide to create an enabling environment. But at the end of the day, if the grassroots programs can't get access to funding, then it really does set us back in terms of our progress on the goals. And I think, especially as Jonas was saying, I think one part of the problem is not highlighting the success stories that are coming. I know, about half of the volunteers at Young Women in Sustainable Development are African-based. We have women doing the most amazing work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Ghana, just leading on these amazing innovative projects that are really looking at climate adaptation in a different way, and often finding really, really resourceful ways to access climate finance that really could be taken and used as excellent case studies for other regions around the world, including where I'm based in the Asia Pacific. And so I think part of it is really that piece about highlighting the amazing work that's happening across the African continent, and the amazing work that's happening in a grassroots kind of level more as well, just so that we can really learn from that and use the amazing example that have been set by these African change makers and embed that sort of into our wider work as well.
Thank you so much, Anne. And that is right. Lead by example, and looking at the success stories from all the planet could also be used in other cases. And well, this is United Nations. We should act united in order for us to face this great threat that it's affecting us, not equally, as I said, but still affecting us. And what better to learn from that experience? And then my next question would be, can African countries gain a better momentum in accessing climate finance in their institutions and stakeholders are provided with innovative capacities and knowledge? How can this be achieved? Through what mechanisms and tools, programs, and initiatives could this be reached? I'll give the floor to Liz.
My response to this will be yes, this is much possible. I think what we have seen in our situation, giving an example in Zimbabwe, is how we have been persistent, making sure that our government is accountable. We have reached to our government and we have sent quite a number of proposals, and through that they have been able to mobilize resources on our behalf as young people, which we have used to do different consultations, and now we are working on implementation. We have different organizations like UNDP who are offering small grants, also through the Climate Promise Funds. I think this is also where most young people can actually get some support in terms of financial resources in Africa. Right now, UNDP has what we call the Climate Promise 2, which is mainly focusing on the implementation part of the NDCs. And considering that from Africa, most of our NDCs, yes, they do have a mitigation component, but they also have an adaptation component. So this will also be an opportunity for a lot of young people to also try to apply and get those resources and implement some of their initiatives that they are doing on the ground. We have quite a number of organizations, that are willing to support young people, but also, I always say that a relationship, if you want to get access to resources, a relationship is reciprocal. So you need to have a relationship with an organization first before you just approach to them and say you need funds for A, B, C, and D. They need to believe in your proposal. The proposal should be very bankable, and you need to actually indicate and show that you will be accountable of the resources that will be allocated to you. So I think this is also something that is important as we are trying to build momentum for COP27, that sometimes persistence is key, and make sure that we are very genuine, transparent, and we are accountable as young people. If we can only highlight that to different partners and to different organizations, I think it will be possible for us to get as much funding as we can.
Thank you so much. Now we ask Anne what she thinks.
What a point that Liz raised there about transparency, about us being really transparent about what we're doing with the funding, about the kind of reports back that we can provide given the capacity at grassroots organisations. I think one thing that I've seen in my experience working sort of on a grassroots level is often organisations try a new type of funding or grant system, and because small youth-led organisations aren't able to report back in the way that lots of that larger NGOs do, that only happens once, and they don't go down that cycle again because they feel like they haven't gotten the report. So I think there is a really big part of that about us being just really transparent in what we can deliver, and working again closely with partners to be able to achieve that. But I think definitely, a lot of progress is being made, and I think we are seeing that real momentum, as Liz said as well, of youth just really being committed to accessing funds and really trying and looking at lots of innovative ways to support different projects. I know in my organisation, we've started supporting trust funds for the Sustainable Development Goals as one of our ways to support smaller organisations. So even though our investment won't have impact in the next year or two, we know that down the line, 10 years, we're helping to solve those longer systemic issues by making more capital available. So I think it really is about using the structures that are in place currently to try and find the adaptation financing, but I think also really looking at the opportunities created by new technologies and building on that momentum as well to try and drive progress.
Thank you. My next question would be, what are the roles of national climate stakeholders, such as young people, women, indigenous peoples and communities, farmers and local communities, to enhance the efforts to African countries to access adaptation finance? Are these roles working and being successful? This is a very interesting question. I give the floor to Liz.
I would love to say yes. These roles are quite important. I mean, if we are talking about tackling the climate problems that are affecting us day in and day out, then we need to come up with an inclusive approach, meaning that all groups, they are quite important, including people with disabilities. They also have a critical role to play, because it's all about leaving no one behind according to the Agenda 2030. You find out that young people, they are the most energetic. They are bringing innovations on the table, which is something that is really needed, especially now, because we need a lot of innovation to tackle the climate crisis alone. Yes, science has spoken, but in order for us to combat or to reduce the effects of climate change, we need innovation, which the young people is putting on the table. And when it comes to indigenous people, they play a very critical role, because over the years, our forefathers and our grandfathers, they've managed to protect and conserve our forests. They've managed to take care of our wetlands without the science. They use their indigenous knowledge to do that. So we cannot totally ignore this group. They play a very essential role when we are talking about, mitigating or adapting to the effects of climate change. And I think it is quite important to learn to merge the two, the indigenous knowledge system and the scientific knowledge that we have, try to merge the two so that we can tackle the climate crisis that we are being faced with. And when it comes to women, I mean, looking at the African continent, women, they spend so many hours in the fields harvesting, etc. Women, according to the Dublin principles, they are capable of conserving water, which is something that is very recommendable. So you find out that these groups, they bring diverse, they have, in their uniqueness, they bring diverse solutions to the climate crisis, and they play a very essential and important role to reduce the effects of climate change. And yes, they are quite important and very much needed.
Thank you, Liz. Mark? Jonas?
We just met before, that's okay, don't worry about it. I think one point that I wanted to highlight when we talk about local communities, I think that especially in the context of adaptation, local communities are incredibly important. And there's been a number of studies that were looking into what makes an adaptation measure not only useful for the moment, but also what sustains it into the future and ensures that this adaptation measure is effective. And one of the key points that were always brought up there were actually bringing in the local community, bringing in the civil society, and making sure that they are on board with the measures that are actually taken care of. So I believe that this is a point that is often being neglected, and I think that focusing on this ensures that the projects that are being proposed are as effective as they can be, which even if it doesn't change the fundamental structure of climate financing, it still makes it more attractive to receive funding and thus being implemented.
Thank you, Jonas. And Anne, what do you think over there?
Yeah, I think as the other two panelists have touched on, we really need a holistic solution to address the climate crisis. So, no one group working by themselves is going to be able to drive progress at the rate necessary. It really is only by all working together, bringing our unique perspectives and our unique knowledge, that we'll be able to, drive progress at the rate the world desperately needs if we're going to mitigate this crisis. But I think in saying that as well, I think that youth particularly do have a huge role to play in that fight. I mean, currently 1.8 billion people, we're the largest youth population in recorded history. And as I think it was Liz that was saying, a very large percentage of people in the African continent do fall into that age group. It's the second largest youth population in the world after the Asian region, which just means there's so much potential there for a youth generation that's really, really committed to taking action and really empowered to drive so much impact. So I think everyone has a role to play, but I think as youth we are uniquely positioned to really be at the forefront of driving that change and making sure that we're including youth from all walks of life, from all ethnicities, from all minority groups. I think we as a generation are very very focused on that inclusion piece, which is just so important as well. So I think, yeah, definitely everyone has a role to play, but I think we as youth really need to engage with each other and support each other to drive action as fast as we possibly can.
Thank you, Anne. And we would also like to call in Mr. Blondel Silno de Manu. I hope I pronounced that well. Could you please introduce yourself and join us on this conversation? What do you think so far from the late answers that have been given to us? Can you hear us? Oh, maybe not. Okay, we will keep working on the technical issues, but then we would like to jump into the next question. What do you think is needed to enhance and empower the roles of citizens and young people in achieving adaptation financing in Africa? Can these stakeholders really play a role? If yes, how and for which impacts? Liz.
Well, that's an interesting question, but I think when it comes to young people, we are mainly looking at upskilling and upscaling. There are two different words. When we're talking about upskilling, we're talking about the skills that young people will need in order for them to adapt. They cannot just wake up tomorrow and start adapting. They do require certain skills. If we are talking about the agricultural sector, what is needed for young people to adapt so that they can improve their yields, they can improve their crops, what is needed for us to open up a lot of green jobs for young people. And if we open those green jobs for them, will they be able to fill in the positions rather than hiring other people from other countries? So there is a need for upskilling our young people. Then when you're talking about upscaling, we are now looking at the initiatives and the small project ideas that they have and see how best we can try to amplify their voices and upscale their initiatives. Or even sometimes it's not only about upscaling, but it's also about replicating the project that they are doing in a certain area. We see that, okay, fine, this project has so many potential, it can be replicated in another area so that other young people can benefit. And in that process, you see that definitely this cannot be done alone. This requires a multi-stakeholder approach. And, we have different organizations that are key in all these processes, and they need to know how best they all fit into the equation and how they can actually get to support young people in their different roles. But yeah, I think this is what I can say.
Thank you, Liz. Jonas, what do you add to this?
So I think this is a very personally relevant question for me, given that I really engage a lot in education and in youth empowerment. So I think there's a multitude of different things that I can think about here when we talk about this. I think that one of the major points is actually that when we talk about access for climate finance in Africa, we should not forget that that doesn't mean that we have to exclusively look at Africa and at what is being done there locally, because I think that actually youth and citizens and a lot of the developed nations have a lot of capacity actually to hold their leaders accountable for the climate pact, for the different financing mechanisms that are in place, because we have to keep in mind that the entire, I'm going to call it, issue of accessibility of the finance is fundamentally based on the fact that the finance is not there and is not being provided. So the most intuitive way to solve this is actually to provide the finance. And of course, this is only being done if the leaders in the different nations are being held accountable for their promises and they actually follow through with their promises. And the only way to do that is if citizens and if youth, of course, keep an eye on these promises, check that they're actually being held. And this involves, of course, the press and the population at large. And in the end, their decision when it comes to voting and the political system will dictate whether or not they have a governance that actually follows through on the promises and actually wants to help finance these measures in Africa. So I think this is something that is very important. And I think that youth has increasingly over the past years, of course, through advocacy, been involved in this process, but I think that there's also been a lot of decision-making processes where youth has not been involved, and where sometimes their voices have been heard but ignored. And so I think that there's a lot of potential there for youth to make sure that their voices are not only heard but also that action follows. And I would like to, I think that this focus, of course, applies to both Africa and to a lot of the developed nations that provide a lot of this climate finance. But nevertheless, of course, the same thing does apply within Africa, and we want to make sure that the African nations represent themselves in a way that they request this finance and they request to receive these resources that are supposed to be theirs.
Thank you for that. It seems like Pascal Metjovanga is online. We would like to call. No? Well, and if not, Anne, what do you think about this? What would be your input?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is a really, really interesting question, and I think for me it goes back to something similar that we were talking about with some of the previous discussion points around really raising awareness about what is happening and what is working well. I think, when I think about the amazing young African women that we work with in my organisation, I always just think about how incredibly innovative they are, how connected they are to their communities, how much they know about their local context and what works, what doesn't work. So I think for me, when I think about, how can we enhance and empower the roles, of young people in achieving climate finance, I just always really think about it back from that community lens, about, these are the change makers in their community. How can we empower them to access the finance they need with the solutions that they've already recognised? So I think for me, a lot of that is just connecting to youth in the field who are already doing all this amazing work, and just providing them with, whether it's the capital, the resources, whatever they need, to be able to set up those systems and structures in a way that they know will benefit their communities, and making sure that we amplify those voices at every stage of discussion, whether that's regionally, nationally, or even in international situations like this. I think the power, of knowing a context and knowing your community really can't be underestimated. So yeah, for me, it really just comes back to seeing what's working and really amplifying those voices.
Thank you. You mentioned a very nice word, community. We are a community. That's the best way to start working as a community, and then multiplying later on the benefits of this cooperation. And as a last question, can you tell us about your organization and the work you do on climate finance and citizen empowerment on this topic? What are some of the success stories your organization has, and how did you empower citizens and young people to engage in your work, focusing on climate action, climate finance, and adaptation to the efforts of global warming? Do you see concrete results and achievements? It's basically tell us about all your work and what you have achieved so far. Liz?
Well, this is a very interesting topic. But yeah, just to say that I work for a youth organization called African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, which is based in Zimbabwe. We have decided to operate as a platform simply because we have realized that amongst members of the organization, we have quite a number of young people who are well knowledgeable on the technical terms of climate change, etc. So the organization has a lot of members, more than 5,000 members that are part of the organization, that are part of AIC, and also more than 100 youth organizations in Zimbabwe. So what we have done is, normally in all the work that we do as AIC, we normally try to work to work with other organizations, especially those that are from the rural areas, that are from the rural communities. We have engaged these young people. We have got some resources from the UNCC land through the government of Zimbabwe, which has enabled us to do certain capacity building sessions, because we also believe that when you are talking about adaptation, there is a component of capacity building. For these young people to learn how to adapt to the effects of climate change, they need to know the basic terms of climate change. And we have been supported by our government as well, and that has linked us to different partners like ACT Alliance and also UNDP, UNICEF, that have also come on board to help us with doing different consultations on youth needs and how best we can move forward in the implementation of adaptation initiatives. Our country is in the process of coming up with its National Adaptation Plan, the NAPS, but also now working on implementing its nationally determined contribution. In all these processes, young people, they've been consulted, young people, they've also sent in their recommendations, and it's just today when I got a message from my government that was telling me to submit a proposal on what we proposed last year in the consultations, where we indicated that we also have plans of creating green jobs through adaptation initiatives and mitigation initiatives, which they are willing to fund. So all this is possible because we have been persistent and we have been well engaging, making sure that we leave no one behind, making sure that we pay particular attention to gender, to people with special needs, because we know that the climate crisis requires all of us to be on board. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Leave no one behind. That's true. Mr. Jonas?
Okay, sorry if I will go through this question one point at a time, because it's, I believe, 4 or 5 questions. So I believe the first point on citizen empowerment is, I think, the most appropriate to the work that we do. We don't directly work on climate finance in our organization. So I mentioned previously the organization is called Climate Science, and we're basically trying to re-innovate the way how climate is educated to all kinds of people. We're mostly focusing on empowering youth, so we're trying to get away from just providing information and actually go about educating and then leading to action, because especially the last part is not that easy, and I believe that when education is being presented, it sometimes misses the actionable perspective to actually go about with the understanding of climate change or with the understanding of certain adaptation or mitigation measure, and actually go into the world and do something with it. So that is a very, very big focus that we have in our organization. We're reaching over 1 million people now with different resources and different programs. But I think that one point that I thought was interesting was, how did you empower citizens and young people to engage in your work focusing on climate action? And I believe actually that the motivation that young people already have to engage on things around climate change is extremely high. I believe that there are so many people that we see in our organization constantly come to us and ask us to get involved and do something and try to help, and they just don't quite know how they can do what they can do or how they can help, but they want to help. The willingness, I believe, is very much there, especially in the youth population. So I believe that giving them guidance, which also incorporates leadership and incorporates giving them direction and giving them all the tools that they need and the support they need to develop as individuals, is actually something that we've seen work really well for our organization, for us to not only focus on the work that we do, but also the people within the organization, because while we provide educational resources and we empower others, we also should live the same process within the own organization. And I believe that that's something that I personally work on, and I believe that that's something that has made a lot of difference to these people to then go out in the world and go about solving a lot of these difficult challenges that climate change brings about, and that we're also talking about today, for example, with climate finance. So there are plenty of results, so many that have already happened, but I believe that, like many youth, I'm very much still on the fence. I believe that there's so much work still to be done, and I love to tell success stories, but I also think that we're all very driven, and we all think that we have to do more, and we have to do better to be able to actually tackle a lot of the challenges that we're having.
Thank you for that. And Anne, what do you think about? What can you tell us, share us?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and I was very excited to hear what all the panel would say, because we all work in such different areas. I think the one thing that really stands out, I guess, for me in terms of my organisation is we really work on a long-term trajectory. I was reading this report recently from the World Resources Institute, where they were estimating that for every dollar invested in climate adaptation, the return on your investment is between $2 and $10. And I thought how fantastic would it be if we could have something similar about what the return of investment is in empowering one young person to take action on climate, because I think, if that could be quantified, I think that would be one of the best returns of investment that you could get. If you had that kind of ROI at Unilever, they'd make you vice president or something. And so for me, what we really focus on is we focus on just empowering youth, giving them the tools and skills they need to be able to take action. I think, as Jonas was saying, there's already this need, this drive, this passion to take action, but often it's just some of those small little skills and tools that are holding them back. I think, as Liz was saying, sometimes it's just not knowing the terminology. You could be doing all this amazing work, but if you're not using the same terminology that policymakers are using when you're going to these meetings, it can really set you back. And so for us, it's just about really providing the support and providing the resources that young women need to do this amazing work that they're already doing, but just allowing it to sort of scale up, to grow the projects and to go on to a bigger level. I always, when I think about success stories, I think about this one incredible young woman who heads our grassroots solutions team, who runs this amazing program in Kenya called Green Path Co. If you get a moment, would highly recommend Googling, all about working with her local community to ensure that agricultural practices are sustainable, so there's a just transition, that while they're dealing with the climate crisis and they're going through this project of adaptation, that people aren't being left behind. And she's this amazing young woman who started this whole project and then joined our network just to empower other young women with the skills to do the same. And so whenever I think about these kinds of questions about what's worked well in the region, I just always think of this amazing project in Kenya, and I could tell you 10, 15 more stories just like that about the amazing work that young African women are doing in the climate space. And I think there really is so much that we can learn from what's happening in the region, and take to our own regions and use some of those learnings in our own communities. And so I think if there's one takeaway for us all after this session, I really hope it will be to look up what some of the African youth are doing, because it's just amazing and inspirational to hear what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you to all our panelists to be here. We would like to open the mic to questions or comments on this session, to our public. Questions, comments? Oh yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hello. I would like to congratulate you first for this presentation, full of information. It's true, adaptation and youth is such a crucial topic in order to achieve our goals, and especially countries from the south that are very impacted in climate change, despite that they are not really it's not really their fault. Like I was saying, thank you, because I was sitting at the back but listening effectively. And it's a bit my field at the moment, trying to engage children. I'm from the Republic Democratic of the Congo. Yes, finance is the big issue. Because you have the willingness to do things and to implement, but it's so difficult to implement without any finance. There's always a way when you find people really engaged, so they will do some voluntary work. And this is what we've been doing at the moment, is working perfectly. We've got focal point all part of, no, not all, like 5 regions of Congo. And we are including women and youth. We even have a group of just young girl, and Miss in French is Mademoiselle, so they call it environnelle, so just environment for the misses, and very active, advocating, and because they are at university level, they go and create awareness now in school, so we can make sure that we got this transformational phase to have more eco-citizen. I create a project, but it's so difficult to implement again because of the finance, called Recreation for recreation. So learning by playing to change the world. My only question is, in your structure, do you like help people to find a way of giving them like a push, even if they've got like a small project, how we can go forward, or even with just some advice? This is my question, and again, congratulations for what you are doing.
Anybody would like to answer the question? And Liz?
Yeah, I can respond to it. Yeah, in terms of, I think if I managed to get the question right, that is there any way we can actually influence young people to apply for project or to get funding?
Actually, I was thinking about getting funding, but to apply for a project is a good idea as well.
Yes, okay, so I will respond this in two ways. In terms of applying for projects, yes, we have so many projects around the African continent, and most of them are bankable projects. We don't want to lie. Yes, we can say young people's projects are not bankable, but most of them are bankable projects. But we still lag behind when it comes to finances, because of sometimes governance structures, they restrict finances, and also the requirements to get the finances sometimes hinders young people to do that. But then when it comes to finances, what has worked in our situation is coming up with a consortium whereby we say, okay, fine, there is a proposal that is there, and we know that there's an organization that is sort of like qualified, or maybe that might have received a grant before. So we have encouraged those organizations to partner with other smaller organizations in coming up with in submitting their proposals. So when that grant eventually, or when that grant is approved, it means that even the smaller organizations, they also get to benefit, and they can also implement their different initiatives in their respective areas. So this is how we have managed to tackle this one.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I might quickly jump in. I think that's a really great question, and it's so exciting to hear about what's happening in DRC. We actually have a team on the ground in DRC who are just doing the most amazing work. I think one thing that we've really found in our organisation is the power of mentoring. just the power of being connected to someone who has done what you're trying to do before. I had a chat just yesterday actually with a girl connected to our organisation who was talking about how she really wanted to start her own NGO. She was really passionate about an issue, but she didn't feel like that was something that she could do. She felt like that was something that you had to be the top of the class to do, and you had to be an expert in your field. But I think, just sharing stories of other young girls who are just like her, just trying to do the same thing. I started this organisation and I'm still learning what we're doing. And I think we're all very much in that space. And I think that really gave her a lot of confidence. And we've seen that with other members of the organisation that we talk to, is sometimes just knowing there's a group of people who will support you. Really does give people the confidence to take that chance and to apply for that grant and apply for that opportunity to scale when it comes along, and even proactively try and find it. I think that's something we've seen work really, really well, and something that we're currently exploring, as well as how we can provide that kind of mentorship experience, but to women in really remote rural areas where they might not have access to someone in person that they can connect to.
Thank you. Jonas, would you like?
Right. I think that there's one thing that we do which is similar to what we previously have talked about as an issue when it comes to capacity, when it comes to kind of the support structures and the networking and the skill set that you sometimes need to be able to apply for grants and apply for funding, and that isn't always accessible to different communities. So how we go about this in our organization, in our case, is where we have different communities, very youth-based in different nations. They don't always have all the things that they need to be able to apply for grants and receive them successfully. So we have a structure where they're able to basically get in touch with the people in our core organization who are then very experienced in writing these proposals, or who have networks, who have access to connections, who then can try to help them in receiving the funding for their own projects. So it's kind of a give and take where both sides are working with each other. And definitely this also includes the mentorship part that we talked about, which is very important, because once they learn the skill sets from someone who's guided them on, for example, a proposal, of course this can help them in the future to maybe make their own proposals, and for them to be able to get funding for their own projects down the line.
Thank you so much for the insightful questions and answers. Anybody else would like to? If that's not the case, we would like to thank you for your time, for coming. Thank you, all of our speakers, for their time and their effort. It was a very nice session. And, well, thank you so much. Thank you for this. And we wish you a very nice evening.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for co-organizing everything as well. And thank you for everyone who joined and all the panelists. It was really nice to kind of have this multidisciplinary approach and hear different people from different backgrounds as well. So as well, I join in on this. Have a beautiful evening, and yeah, hope we see each other someday.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.